Richard Carter stood up, champagne glass trembling slightly in his hand. 300 guests watching him smile at his only daughter's wedding. Then he opened his mouth, and in front of everyone he loved and everyone he barely knew, he tore her new husband apart, piece by piece. Nobody in that ballroom knew that in less than an hour, Richard would be on his knees, begging the same man for forgiveness. Nobody knew what Jason Miller had been carrying quietly for the last 3 years, and nobody, not even Emily, the bride, standing frozen in white lace, could have predicted how this night would end. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand how a father could humiliate his own daughter's husband in front of an entire wedding, we have to go back nearly 25 years, long before Emily Carter was even born, to the year Richard first opened the doors of his own trucking company, with nothing but a used pickup truck and a loan he wasn't sure he could repay. Richard grew up the son of a factory worker in Dayton, Ohio, watching his own father come home exhausted every night, his hands cracked and his back permanently bent from decades of labor that never seemed to lead anywhere better. Richard promised himself as a teenager that he would build something of his own, something with his name on it, something that would let his future children live differently than he had. He worked 18-hour days for the better part of 2 decades. He missed birthdays, missed anniversaries, missed the small ordinary moments that make up a family, all in service of a business that eventually grew into something real. 12 trucks, 4 employees, a modest office off Route 4 with his name painted on the window. By the time Emily was in middle school, Richard had become the kind of man people in town nodded to with respect, a self-made success story who never let anyone forget how hard he'd worked to get there. But that same hunger that built his company also hardened something in him, a belief that struggle was the only proof of worth, and that anyone who hadn't clawed their way up the same way hadn't truly earned their place. Emily grew up watching her father's exhaustion and her mother's quiet patience in equal measure. Linda Carter had been a school teacher for 30 years, gentle in a way Richard never quite learned to be. And it was Linda who taught Emily to notice people's hearts before their resumes. Emily became a nurse, drawn to the same instinct her mother carried, the belief that people deserved kindness regardless of what they did for a living. She worked nights in the emergency department at Miami Valley Hospital, where exhaustion, grief, and quiet heroism all blurred together into 12-hour shifts that taught her more about character than any classroom ever could. It was on one of those night shifts, in the spring 3 years before the wedding, that she met Jason Miller for the first time. He walked into the emergency room a little after 11, his hand wrapped in a bloody shop rag, sheepishly explaining that he'd been fixing an elderly neighbor's truck for free when the wrench slipped. Emily noticed immediately that he wasn't complaining about the pain. He was more worried about finishing the job the next morning so the neighbor wouldn't be late for a doctor's appointment. She stitched his hand herself, 7 stitches across his palm, and found herself asking him questions long after the wound was cleaned and dressed, questions she didn't usually ask patients. Jason Miller had grown up on the other side of town, in a small rented house with his mother after his father left when he was 9 years old. His mother worked 2 jobs, a diner shift in the mornings and a cleaning job at night, just to keep the lights on and food on the table. Jason started fixing cars at 14, first for neighbors who couldn't afford a mechanic, then professionally once he was old enough to apprentice at a local garage. He never finished college, not because he lacked the mind for it, but because his mother's health began declining when he was 20, and someone needed to work full-time to help cover her medications. He never once described this as a sacrifice. To him, it was simply what you did for people you loved. Emily and Jason's relationship grew slowly over the following 2 years, built on long conversations after her shifts ended and his garage closed, built on the kind of steady, unglamorous trust that doesn't announce itself with fireworks but instead shows up quietly, again and again, until it becomes undeniable. Jason remembered small details about her, the way she preferred her coffee, the anniversary of her grandmother's passing, the fact that she hated silence in the car and always wanted the radio on low. Emily loved that he never tried to impress her with grand gestures, only with consistency, the same quiet reliability she'd grown up admiring in her mother. When Emily finally brought Jason home to meet her parents, she was nervous but hopeful. Linda welcomed him warmly from the very first dinner, asking him thoughtful questions about his mother's health and genuinely listening to his answers. Richard, however, treated the introduction like a job interview. He asked Jason about his 5-year plan, his retirement savings, whether he had any ambition to move up from working on cars with his hands. Jason answered every question honestly, without defensiveness, explaining that he was proud of his trade and had no interest in pretending to be something he wasn't just to make a stranger comfortable. Richard nodded along that night, but later told Linda privately that their daughter was settling. Over the following 2 years, that tension never fully disappeared. At every holiday dinner, Richard found subtle ways to remind Jason of the gap he perceived between them, mentioning his own company's growth, asking pointed questions about Jason's savings account, occasionally introducing him to family friends as Emily's boyfriend, the mechanic, in a tone that made the word feel smaller than it should have. Jason never rose to the bait. He'd simply smile, change the subject, and later tell Emily privately that her father would come around eventually, that some people needed time to trust what they couldn't immediately measure. Emily wasn't so sure, but she loved him too much to let her father's doubt shape her decision. What none of them knew, not even Emily, was that roughly 18 months before the wedding, Linda had quietly been diagnosed with a heart condition requiring a procedure their insurance only partially covered. Linda, private by nature and unwilling to worry her daughter during nursing school finals, mentioned it only once, in passing, to a hospital co-worker while picking up a prescription refill, unaware that Jason happened to be standing nearby, waiting on his own mother's medication. He didn't say anything that day. He simply filed the information away, quietly, the way he filed away most things that mattered. Richard, meanwhile, had been carrying his own private weight. The trucking business had suffered a difficult year after losing 2 major contracts, and the remaining balance on Linda's procedure sat heavier on him than he ever let on. He refinanced what he could, cut his own expenses everywhere possible, and lay awake more nights than he'd ever admit, terrified of what it would mean if he couldn't provide the same security he'd spent his whole life building. He never told Linda the full extent of his worry. He never told Emily at all. Pride, the same pride that built his company, kept him from asking anyone for help, even the people who loved him most. Jason, without telling a single soul, began picking up extra shifts at the garage almost immediately after overhearing Linda's conversation. Weekends, holidays, late nights after his regular hours ended, he quietly worked to set aside whatever he could. He told Emily he was simply saving up for their future home. He never mentioned Linda's procedure, never mentioned the number he was chasing, because to him, this wasn't something that required credit or conversation. It was simply something a person did for family, even a family that hadn't fully accepted him yet. The wedding arrived on a warm September afternoon, the kind of golden, breezy day that seems to bless everything it touches. The ceremony took place in a small chapel outside of town, followed by a reception in a tent strung with warm lights on the Carter family's own property. Emily had never looked happier, and Jason kept glancing at her throughout the vows as though he still couldn't quite believe his own luck. Friends cried, Linda cried. Even Richard, for one unguarded moment during the ceremony, watched his daughter's face and felt something in his chest soften, a flicker of acceptance he hadn't expected to feel. But old resentment rarely dissolves in a single afternoon, no matter how beautiful the light or how sincere the vows. By the time the reception moved into its toasts, something in Richard had tightened again, some old familiar insecurity resurfacing beneath the surface of his pride. He told himself he only wanted to be honest, that fathers were allowed to want more for their daughters, that honesty at a wedding was simply a kind of love. He didn't yet realize how badly he was about to confuse honesty with cruelty. Richard stood, tapped his glass gently with a fork, and the room quieted with the warm, expectant hush that follows every father of the bride toast. Guests smiled, ready for sentiment. Instead, Richard began speaking about hard work and ambition, about the kind of man he'd always pictured his daughter marrying, someone driven, someone constantly climbing. Then he turned toward Jason and said, in front of everyone, that he hoped Emily wouldn't spend her life settling, that he hoped someday Jason would become more than just a mechanic with grease under his nails. A few guests laughed nervously, assuming it was an awkward attempt at humor. Emily's smile collapsed instantly. The laughter died within seconds as Richard kept going, listing every quiet doubt he'd swallowed for 2 years, every private comment he'd only ever shared with Linda, now spilling out in front of 300 witnesses. He mentioned Jason's lack of a college degree. He mentioned his own sacrifices as a young man, implying Jason had never truly struggled the same way. Linda gripped her husband's arm, whispering his name sharply, but Richard, caught in some strange momentum of pride and nerves, didn't stop until he'd said nearly everything he'd never had the courage to say directly to Jason's face before that night. Jason sat perfectly still through all of it, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the white tablecloth in front of him. Emily's eyes filled with tears, darting between her father and her husband, waiting for Jason to defend himself, to say something, anything. Instead, he simply set down his fork, folded his napkin with quiet deliberateness, and rose from his seat. For one long terrible moment, the entire tent assumed he was about to walk away from the marriage itself, the humiliation finally too much to bear. If you were sitting at that table, watching the man you loved get humiliated by your own father on your wedding day, what would you have done in that moment? Would you have stood up and defended him immediately? Or would you have frozen the way Emily did, unsure whose side to take first? Tell us honestly in the comments, because what Jason did next changed the entire trajectory of that night. Jason didn't raise his voice, and he didn't walk toward the exit. Instead, he walked calmly toward the microphone Richard had just set down, and quietly asked if he could say a few words. Richard, caught off guard by the request, nodded stiffly, unsure what to expect. Jason thanked the guests for coming, then turned, not to Richard, but to Linda, and gently asked how she'd been feeling since her procedure the previous spring. The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Linda's face went pale instantly. Richard's expression shifted from wounded pride to visible confusion, his mind racing to understand what his new son-in-law could possibly know about something he himself had barely admitted to his own wife. Jason explained calmly that he'd overheard Linda mention the remaining balance to a coworker almost a year and a half earlier, entirely by accident, while waiting on a prescription of his own. He explained that he'd spent the following 4 months picking up every extra shift the garage would give him, working weekends and holidays, quietly setting aside what he earned until he'd covered the remainder of what the insurance hadn't. He said he never mentioned it to anyone, not Emily, not Linda, not a single friend, because he never did it for recognition. He did it because Linda had treated him like family from the very first dinner, long before Richard ever did, and because watching someone he cared about carry that kind of fear alone felt unbearable to him. The tent fell completely silent. Linda began to cry, covering her mouth with both hands, her shoulders shaking as 3 years of quiet gratitude finally broke loose all at once. Emily turned toward her father, stunned, waiting for him to say something, anything, while guests who moments earlier had laughed nervously now sat in complete, humbled stillness. Richard stood frozen at the head table, the champagne glass still resting in his hand, watching 2 years of certainty about this man collapse in the space of 30 seconds. He set the glass down slowly, the sound of it against the table unnervingly loud in the silence. He walked around the head table toward Jason, and for the first time all evening, the guests watched a completely different kind of moment unfold. Richard didn't say much at first, simply gripping Jason's shoulder, his voice breaking as he admitted, in front of the same 300 people who just watched him tear this man down, that he had been wrong. He apologized not only for the toast, but for 2 years of quiet doubt. 2 years of making Jason feel like he needed to prove himself for something he had already been doing, without asking for a single thing in return. Jason simply nodded, told him it was already forgiven, and pulled him into a brief, firm hug that drew a quiet, collective exhale from the entire tent. Emily, tears streaming freely now, rushed to embrace her mother first, then her husband, then finally, hesitantly, her father, the four of them standing together in a nod of relief and disbelief, while the string lights swayed gently overhead in the evening breeze. Somewhere near the back, someone began clapping, quietly at first. Then the sound spread through the tables until the whole reception was applauding, not for a toast, but for the truth that had just been revealed.
The rest of the evening felt entirely different after that. Guests who had been whispering nervously moments earlier now approached Jason throughout the night, shaking his hand, telling him how deeply his words had moved them. Linda held onto his hand for a long time during the first dance, thanking him quietly through tears, telling him she wished she'd found the courage to tell Emily the truth herself instead of letting him carry that secret alone. Richard spent much of the night quieter than usual, watching his daughter dance with her husband, replaying his own toast over and over, understanding now how close he had come to damaging something that had never needed his approval in the first place. Emily didn't say much to her father that night, needing time to process the whiplash of humiliation and relief within the same hour. But the following morning, before she and Jason left for their honeymoon, she found him alone on the back porch, still in yesterday's rumpled shirt, staring out at the empty tent being taken down in the yard. She sat beside him quietly and told him she was proud of who he'd chosen to become in that ballroom, even if it had taken him far too long and far too much humiliation to get there. Richard, unable to find better words, simply told her he was sorry and that he intended to spend the rest of his life earning back the trust he'd nearly lost in a single, careless toast. 6 months later, Richard and Jason spoke on the phone every week, something neither of them would have predicted a year earlier. Richard began stopping by the garage some Saturday mornings, at first to check on his daughter's husband out of obligation, then eventually because he genuinely enjoyed Jason's company, learning things about engines and patience that surprised him. Linda's health remained stable, and she often joked, gently, that her son-in-law had saved her twice, once financially, and once by finally teaching her husband the difference between success and worth. Richard never fully forgave himself for that toast, but he made peace with it by becoming, slowly and deliberately, the father-in-law he should have been from the very beginning. What this story really asks us, underneath all of it, is a simple and uncomfortable question. How often do we measure someone's value by their job title, their income, or their resume, instead of by what they quietly do for the people they love when no one is watching or keeping score? Jason never once asked for recognition. He worked extra shifts in silence, carried a secret out of loyalty, and never used it as leverage, not even when he had every reason to defend himself in front of an entire room. And Richard, for all his pride, still found the courage to admit he was wrong in front of the very people who had just watched him be wrong in the first place. That kind of humility, arriving late but arriving honestly, is rarer than we like to admit. If you were Emily, would you have forgiven your father as quickly as she did, or would his humiliation have left a wound that took much longer to heal? And if you were Richard, standing there in front of everyone, could you have found the strength to apologize immediately, or would your pride have kept you silent a while longer? We'd genuinely love to know how you would have handled either side of this story. So let us know in the comments below. We always love reading your perspective. If this story moved you tonight, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. Stories like Emily and Jason's remind us that the truest measure of character often reveals itself in the quietest moments, long before anyone else is paying attention. In our next story, a woman clearing out her late grandmother's attic finds a single unopened letter that unravels a 50-year-old family secret nobody in her family was ever prepared to face.